Welcome to Quilt Fix, because sometimes mistakes happen. Hi, I'm Angelique, and in this Quilt Fix video, I'm going to show you how you can repair seams. Now this is for seams that you've already quilted the whole thing, or maybe you're in process of quilting and you rip a seam, and these things sometimes happen, especially when we're new quilters. And so I'm going to show you, because of like washing, or maybe we didn't pre-wash our fabric, or maybe our seam allowance wasn't quite right when we sewed our blocks together, how we can fix those pop seams and get right back to using that quilt that we love so much. So be sure to like and subscribe and click on the bell so you get notifications and more great content on quilting, fixing quilts, and everything you can think about for sewing. There are a lot of different ways that you can fix seams, and I'm only going to have time to show you a few of my favorites. So let's get started with the invisible seam. Now the invisible seam works best on seams that don't have any or very little fraying. We are going to be hand sewing because it's kind of hard to hide any kind of fixes if you're doing machine sewing. Now, if you don't mind seeing it on the back of your quilt, then go for it, but this is a way that you're not going to impact what the back of your quilt looks like. And so for this one, I'm gonna recommend that the type of needle that you use is like a traditional needle, sewing needle, or like a Milner. Something that's kind of small, you know, just kind of what you're used to sort of seeing. I like to use a matching thread color because I'm not the best hand sewist. And so that way, if it does kind of peek through a little bit, it's going to blend. But the purpose of this is really just to bury that knot. And I'm using a single strand. And I always like to kind of start where I have a good seam still. So you can see this is opened up here. And I also sometimes find if I'm having trouble where it just doesn't want to kind of lay the way that I want it to, of using some thin pins to hold my seam down. So let's put a few nice little pins in here. It's kind of like I'm pre-sewing just to help me keep the seam in place so I don't have to fight it. The way that this piece came undone, you can kind of see I still have the fold that has been created from when I pressed it originally, and then the other side is laying here. So what I'm going to find that's going to work best is for me to take just a few pieces, like just a few strands of the row underneath, and I'm going to carefully pull that thread through. And now that I have that side, then I'm just going to kind of fold this back a little bit. And along that edge that's right across, I want to grab a couple more little pieces. Right. And I don't have to tighten right away because honestly, I'm going to be kind of moving the fabric as I go. So it's okay if it's a little loose to start with. But now that I've got that side, I'm going to move back to my pink, grab a couple of those threads. All right, now that I'm in the pink, I'm going to go back to the yellow. If you're like me and it's a little hard for you to see, it could be nice to have a little magnifying glass. A lot of lighting is helpful, but you can do this, you know, you're sitting at the TV, you're watching your favorite movie or television show, and you're just working to get that seam fixed. So that's looking good, and we're just going to continue that process all the way down. All right, so we're at the end of our stitch, and the closer that you do your stitching like this, the flatter it's going to lay. And we're just going to give it just a little bit of a tug to make sure that it's nice and secure all the way through. And then what I like to do is I like to feed my needle through the original stitching where it's still good. And that's where I'm going to put my knot. So right in that seam line, sort of like stitching in the ditch, if you will. I'll do this 1 or 2 times, but that's going to help me kind of fasten off securely and bury my little loop that I'm creating here in the actual seam. And then I'm ready to just clip really close. And I have a nice flat seam again. It's not going to look exactly how it looked before, but again, it's going to close that up so the next time that you use it or wash it, it's going to stay that way so you can continue to use. Hand darning, or darning in general, is a way of using thread to cover an area and sort of weaving it one direction and then the other to really kind of close that over. And it's going to work good for seams that are really a bit more ripped, like the one that I have here. It's very rough on one side, which means I'm not going to be able to grab those couple little strands like we did in the last one. I'm going to have to cover that. And just like with the other one, I'm going to start with some pins, and I'm using a little bit different pin here on one side because I'm using it to kind of push this fabric a little bit more towards the other one. And then I'll use my singles here to help me hold down this side. Now, unlike the invisible stitch that we just did, darning is going to show. So we're going to try to mitigate that as much as possible by using a matching thread. And this area that I chose is 2 yellows. So I decided to go with our Finesse Classic Amber because I think it'll blend that bridge really nicely. Now for this one, because we are trying to cover the area, we want more thread. So I've got a double strand of thread here. Basically, you take it all the way through and create that knot at the bottom of both sides of the strand. And just like we did before, we're going to do a little bit of bearing of that knot. Now, for this needle, I am using a darning needle. The darning needle that I have is a little bit longer, so it's what's going to make it easier for me when I get to the weaving part, because that's the part that happens after I've kind of created this bridge that I'm going to make here, and I want to be able to reach that needle. And if my needle is too short, it's going to be hard for me to do that. And so for this one, we're just going to go from one side to the other, very close stitches, and I'm going to go over, back the other side, catching the next. And this one I'm going to pull a little tighter as I go so that I can create this loop that's going over the area. And then I'm just going to keep working that all the way across to cover that seam. Remember, we only want to go through the area that we're covering. If you catch a little batting, that's okay. We just don't want to go through the back. Now, this particular quilt that I'm working on is one of my first quilts that I was piecing. And it's my couch quilt. It's my little cuddly one for, the cold winter springs that we have here in Utah. And it was a kit, it was pre-cuts, which can be a lot of fun. But once I started kind of putting it together after doing my rows, again, being one of my first quilts, I was really struggling to get stuff to line up. And so I tried to cheat as not knowing what I was doing, because again, like I said, this is one of my first quilts. I decided that it'd be a good idea to do less than 1/4 of an inch stitch. And in some places, that meant 1/8 of an inch stitch. And because these were pre-cuts, this is definitely not fabric that I would have considered washing ahead of time, because that would make it all, rough edged and everything. So I just went with it, sewed it all together. And then of course, when I washed it, that little bit of natural shrinkage that we get between our thread and our batting and our cotton top here was enough for some of these seams to come out. And because I've washed this one a few times, or I've repaired this a few times as well, just trying to do a hidden seam's just not going to do it anymore. So I'm going to continue working on this, and once I get it to the end, we'll come back and I'll show you the next step. So I have gone all the way to the end and overlapped a little bit of the seam that was good. Now I'm going to do the same stitch all the way back on the other side to really fill in. This time I'm going to work the opposite direction. So I'll continue working in the opposite direction, then we'll come back and I'll show you the next step. For the next step, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to weave. Now I could go all the way if I wanted to, but I'm going to do this in small sections because I just know how delicate this quilt is. But I'm just going to kind of weave my needle through, and then I'm going to come back, looping that thread over, and then pushing that needle through again. So I did just a little short section there for you. And I'm going to continue to do that all the way around. Now I think the next one, I'm going to see if I can get it a little bit further now that I know it's nice and secure, because I did have to start a new piece of double thread. And we're just going to do that a few times to really sort of bring all of this together and smooth it out the best that we can. So this is the weaving step. Now I don't want to pull too hard when I do that because I'm trying to create a flatter surface. So just tight enough that the thread will lay flat. So I'm going to continue to work on that, and we'll come back and I'll show you the finished result. All right, so I've done my cross weaves this way, and now I'm just doing a few little securing stitches to hold that weave in place, very similar to what I did in the very first part. Now, darning is especially good for like a kid's quilt. Maybe they just love this quilt, and you know that they're just going to be hard on it because kids play hard, and you want it to really last. And so this is definitely going to hold it together really nicely. Like I said, you are going to be able to see it up close, but if you match your thread, you should be able to hide it pretty well from a distance. Remember the horseback rule. If you can ride by it on the horseback and not see it, it's fine. And then we'll do what we did before for finishing off. I'm getting a little low on thread here, so I'm just going to kind of start creating my knots a little early. I think this will be my last stitch here. All right, and I'm ready to fasten off. So we have a nice weaved stitch. Again, you are going to be able to feel it, you are going to be able to see it, but that seam is not going to come apart on you again. All right, let's move on to our next one. The next method I'm going to show you is decorative stitching. So this is basically embroidery that we're going to do on our quilt top. Now for this particular one, I chose this quilt. The seam is really more in my binding area, and I've tried to repair this a couple of times. Now this is the first time, or this quilt is the first quilt that I've ever done that was all flannel. And it was smaller than I imagined it would be, and I had this leftover minky, and I thought, oh, I'll add minky to it. It'll give it a nice soft little border on both sides, and you know, just something to kind of pet and cuddle with. And then I had to wash it, and the shrinkage on this, of course, was so much more. It was a quilt kit, so again, I didn't feel like I should wash it ahead of time. I kind of learned from that one. And so right here you can see where, and it's several places along this quilt, where the minky, this is a very furry, you know, high loft minky that you have here, and it just didn't catch. It looked like it caught, and it didn't catch. And I have taken this out, and I've tucked it back in, and I've sewn the binding again. My standard 2.5-inch binding was just not enough to hold all of this. And so I'm just going to do a decorative stitch around this area, but now that I've started it, I'm gonna be working on this for a while at home in front of the TV as I kind of do it all the way around so that it blends in. So you kind of have to think about that when you choose to do a decorative stitch, that it becomes a design element that you have for your quilt. And what I did is I went into my stash of embroidery thread that I have, and I just found some colors that go with my quilt, and I'm just going to kind of alternate these through just to kind of give it that little extra decorative. I'm just going to use one of the greens that I have right now for this one, and this embroidery floss that I'm using, I have split it, so I've got like a double strand on here. But I only want a double strand of what I'm stitching, not 4 strand. So I'm doing it very similar to the method I did with the first one, where I'm treating it like a single strand. Right, so just like we had the other ones, we're going to want to knot this end, and we want to bury that knot, and I'm going to bury that actually in my binding. Okay, so I am going to do the blanket stitch for this one because I want it to kind of catch, but maybe ride right in the ditch there for the line. And so I thought this would be a good one, but there are many embroidery stitches that you can choose from that would be good for this kind of thing, like the fly or the fern stitch, you know, because you're bringing those points together. Even a cross stitch, something like you're kind of like Xing it through, but I just thought for this particular location, the blanket stitch would be the best. And as I kind of get back to that, do me a favor, give us a thumbs up if you're enjoying this video, finding it useful, or any of our other videos. Also let us know in the comments what you'd like to see next on Quilt Fix. Okay, so now I'm going to come back around to the other side, and I'm going to catch that, and I'm going to just basically create a straight line that's going vertical from me. And then I'm going to come over into that ditch, and I'm going to create my straight line that's going to go horizontal, and I'm going to grab the next part, and I want to keep them pretty even. And this is just because the fur here, the minky, is so fluffy. It's just gonna create like this pop of color. Now, the hardest thing about the blanket stitch is trying to get my stitches even across. So it could be very helpful to use a pen to mark where you want all your lines to go to help guide that. I'm just eyeballing it for now. But if you definitely have something that is gonna be very visible, that is a recommendation I have for you. All right, I'm gonna keep working on this, finish this up, and then I'll show you what it looks like when we get back. All right, so I've done my decorative stitch. You can kind of see it here. I did have to double each one to really get it to show up, you know, because this one is supposed to be visible. So what I've also done is I have one here so you can get a better look at the decorative stitch, the blanket stitch that we're doing here. And just in case, maybe a little bit of reinforcement on how to do that, I'm going to, because again, I'm not going all the way through like typical embroidery. I'm just gonna go over, catch a few strands, and that's gonna create my straight line. So you can see that there. And then I'm gonna come up straight from there, going through just the one layer, back through, and that's gonna create that straight vertical part. And then I just go over to the next one. If I didn't mention earlier, the needle that I am using for this one is an embroidery needle, and the reason you want to use an embroidery needle is because it's got a larger eye, and that's going to make it easier to get your embroidery floss through it. Those couple of strands that you need, but like I said, you are going to be able to see this stitch. It's just going to become a creative touch that you're adding to reinforce that seam or to repair that seam that has come undone for you. All right, let's get to our last method I want to show you. Now, if you have an area of a seam that is just really tore up, like this one here, you can see it's very, very frayed, then this method may be best for you. And what we're going to do is we're going to reinforce the area with some spare fabric. So it works great if you still have any leftovers. I just grabbed some solids because, like I said, this was a kit that was already kind of pre-cut. And I think that what I'm going to do is add this little bit of yellow because there's a lot of yellow here. And we're going to need something that is double fusible. So it's going to be fusible on both sides to create the patch. So this is a patch we're actually going to tuck underneath. Now you could, that would be like a fifth method, would be just putting a patch over it, which is good for holes and stuff like that. But I wanted to try to preserve the look of the quilt as much as possible. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that this is going to be wide enough to cover. So let me cut off that excess. And I've got a lot, quite a bit of space in here where I can get my finger in. So that gives me an idea of like how much width that I could probably handle, which we can always trim down once we kind of get to where we're at. Now, the reason that we want to use something that is sticky is because we want it to stay in place once we kind of get it in there. So that looks like I need a good cut across here. All right, we're going to go over to our ironing station, and we're going to add this to our fusible fabric here, which I'll just cut myself a small piece of. This is why I save leftovers. It's like I never know when I'm gonna have like some tiny little piece of fabric that I need to use. All right, so let me just move that for a second. Take my needle, try to get off the first layer here while I'm at my cutting board. So I'm going to take the sticky side, I'm going to find the wrong side of my fabric, and I'm going to press that on with just my fingers. Now I'm going to take my iron, and I'm using a dry iron, and according to the manufacturer instructions of the one that I'm using, so something that's good for like applique, I'm transferring the adhesive to the wrong side of my fabric. And I like to iron both sides. Do a little test, make sure that that adhesive is transferred to the fabric. Oh yeah, that's on there. So now I want to take my paper off, because it's got paper on both sides, and I'm going to bring my quilt over where I have that rip. So we're going to tuck that in both sides, and if I still need to do some trimming of my fabric, I can, so I'm halfway there. All right, so as you can see, that fabric is now underneath, and I just have it pressed, finger pressed on there. Now I'm going to press it really good with the iron, with steam this time, so I can really set that reinforcement fabric. All right, so now I have fabric underneath that I can grab to do a little bit more of a stitch here. So I'll be able to do something that looks a little bit more like that invisible stitch we did earlier. So just like before, I tucked in my knot. May have to get in there with some tweezers to do that, but kind of buried it where it was kind of before. And now when I pull up this fabric, I'm actually going underneath and I'm grabbing the fabric that's underneath, but you can see now that I can get this back over my rough area here, and it's going to hold in place. I mean, I'm still gonna have that little bit of roughness, obviously, but I can get this back over with the invisible stitch, and it's nice and secure, and it's just gonna look like it was part of the quilt, because it's just going to give you something to grab a hold of. And that's pretty much it for this. The rest of the technique is the same as the first part I showed you. So to not bore you with me continuing to sew this, again, we went over 4 different methods that you can use to fix those seams on an already quilted project. I am going to have a handout for you to show you some of those seams, kind of help you out, especially if you're new to hand sewing, and maybe a few little tips and tricks to make it a little bit easier on you. And if you've got a particular technique that you like to use for fixing seams, let us know in the comments below this video. The handout you'll find in the description of this video. And until next time, we hope you're able to fix your quilts. Bye-bye.